It's August 16th, 1969. A band that hasn't released a single album is standing on a stage in front of roughly 400,000 people. The guitarist is 22 years old. He's taken mescaline earlier in the afternoon, expecting he'd have more time before his set. He doesn't. They call his name. He walks out, and the guitar in his hands feels, in his own words, like a snake trying to slither away from him. He grips it tighter. He starts to play. And over the next 45 minutes, something happens that nobody at Woodstock expected. A young Mexican guitarist with a sound that doesn't belong to any single genre delivers one of the most electrifying performances in the history of rock music. The song is called Soul Sacrifice, and the career it launches will take 3 decades, 2 disappearances, 1 spiritual transformation, and the most improbable comeback in modern music to fully understand. But Woodstock wasn't where Carlos Santana's story began. That story starts in a small village in Mexico with a violin he hated and a father he worshipped. Carlos Humberto Santana Barragan was born on July 20th, 1947 in Atlan de Navarro, a remote town in the state of Jalisco, Mexico. His father, Jose Santana, was a mariachi violinist, not a hobbyist, a professional. Jose played in local bands, led a touring mariachi group called Los Cardinales, and earned his living entirely from music. Carlos's grandfather had also been a musician. Music wasn't a career choice in the Santana family, it was a bloodline. Jose started teaching Carlos the violin when he was 5. Carlos later described the experience with something close to physical disgust. He didn't like the smell of the instrument, he didn't like the sound, he didn't like the way it felt against his body. 3 strikes. But what he did love was watching his father play. He loved watching the way women looked at his father when he performed, the way people in their small town would light up. Carlos didn't just want to play music, he wanted to be adored. When Carlos was about 7, the family moved to Tijuana. The border town was a shock. Jose put his sons to work selling chiclets and shining shoes on the street. Carlos played Mexican folk songs for tourists at 50 cents apiece. Eventually, his father brought him along to gigs in dirt-floored bars and strip clubs. Carlos was barely a teenager, earning $9 a week, providing musical accompaniment while learning things no child should have to learn that early. But Tijuana gave him something else, American radio. For the first time, Carlos heard B.B. King. He heard T-Bone Walker. He heard Ray Charles and Little Richard. And something inside him shifted. The rigid forms of mariachi, the music his father championed, started feeling too small. He picked up the guitar, and the instrument that the violin never was suddenly became his voice. A local guitarist named Javier Batiz became his real teacher. Batiz led a Tijuana band called the TJs, and Carlos's mother, Josefina, actually encouraged her son to go watch them play. Carlos showed up with his father's guitar and asked for lessons. Batiz taught him the electric blues, how to bend notes, how to make the guitar cry. Carlos memorized B.B. King records note for note. He absorbed R&B, rock and roll, and whatever else came through the radio. But here's what made the difference. Most young American guitarists in the early 1960s were learning blues from blues, rock from rock. They grew up inside one musical tradition and expanded outward from there. Carlos was doing something different. He was filtering all of it through years of mariachi, Mexican folk songs, and Latin rhythms he'd been hearing since birth, the clavey rhythms his father played, the call and response patterns of the street musicians in Atlan, the raw energy of the strip club bands in Tijuana. He wasn't choosing between musical languages, he was collecting them, and without realizing it, he was building a sound that nobody else could replicate because nobody else had lived the same combination of influences. Years later, Carlos would describe his mother's scolding as a musical influence, the rhythm of her voice when she was angry, the way her sentences rose and fell, the percussive cadence of her disapproval. He found those patterns in his guitar solos. You can cuss or you can pray with the guitar, he said. That's not a metaphor, it's a description of how he plays. By the time Carlos was a teenager, he'd already developed the quality that would define his entire career. Most guitarists tried to play fast. Carlos played slow. Where other players demonstrated technique, Santana emphasized tone, long, sustained notes, vibrato that felt like it was breathing, melodic lines that sang instead of shredded. If you heard 3 notes from his guitar, you knew who was playing, not because of speed, because of feeling. His family moved to San Francisco in the early 1960s. Carlos actually resisted He was a working musician in Tijuana. He didn't want to leave, but eventually he followed, and the timing turned out to be extraordinary. San Francisco in the mid-1960s was a furnace of musical invention. The Haight-Ashbury scene was exploding. Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Big Brother and the Holding Company were creating psychedelic rock in real time. Jazz clubs were thriving. Tito Puente records were playing in Latin neighborhoods. Carlos worked as a dishwasher in a downtown diner, jammed on weekends for spare change, and absorbed everything. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1965. He saw B.B. King play live for the first time and nearly wept. The records he'd memorized in Tijuana were one thing. Watching King bend a note on stage was something else entirely. The Bay Area also introduced him to jazz, to international folk music, to salsa from masters like Tito Puente and Eddie Palmieri. San Francisco was, as Carlos later described it, a cornucopia. Every genre existed within a few blocks of every other genre, and Carlos absorbed them all. By 1966, he'd formed the Santana Blues Band with David Brown on bass and Greg Rowley on keyboards, the name shortened to Santana. The lineup eventually expanded to include drummer Michael Shreve, who was only 16 when he joined, and percussionists Jose Chapito Arias and Michael Carabello on congas and timbales. That percussion section was the key. No mainstream rock band in America was using congas and timbales as foundational instruments. Santana wasn't adding Latin flavoring to rock music, he was building rock music on a Latin rhythmic foundation. The difference is structural, and it's the reason nobody else sounded like them. The band started playing at Bill Graham's legendary Fillmore West in San Francisco. Graham was the most influential concert promoter in the country, and he became Santana's manager. It was Graham who got them the slot at Woodstock. The deal was specific. Graham agreed to help promote the festival in exchange for Santana getting a performance slot. The band hadn't released an album. They had no national profile. They were a regional act being thrown in front of the largest audience in the history of live music. And then came that Saturday afternoon, August 16, 1969. The band was scheduled to go on later, and Carlos had taken mescaline expecting he'd have time to ride it out. He didn't. The schedule shifted. Suddenly it was their turn. Carlos walked onto that stage while peaking on a psychedelic. The crowd stretched further than he could see. He later said he was praying the entire time, asking God to please keep the guitar in tune and keep him in time with the band. The mescaline, the snake-like guitar, the 400,000 faces. The band launched into Soul Sacrifice, an 11-minute instrumental built on Afro-Cuban guaguanco rhythms laced with American blues guitar. Arias and Carabello locked into a percussion groove that sounded ancient and electric at the same time. Michael Shreve, 20 years old, delivered a drum solo that's still considered one of the greatest ever captured on film, and over all of it, Carlos Santana played guitar lines that wailed and cried and sang in a voice nobody had heard from a rock band before. The crowd clapped above their heads. They shouted for more. The Woodstock documentary film, released in 1970, included that performance. It was shot in full daylight, and the footage is stunning. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of Santana were watching this unknown guitarist conjure something they couldn't categorize. Was it rock? Was it Latin? Was it blues? Was it jazz? The answer was yes, and that confusion was the point. Within days of Woodstock, Santana's self-titled debut album was released on Columbia Records. The single Evil Ways climbed to number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album went platinum multiple times, but the debut was just the opening statement. In September 1970, the band released Abraxas, and it became the record that defined them. Abraxas hit number 1 on the Billboard 200 and stayed on the chart for 88 weeks. It eventually went quintuple platinum. The album's 2 biggest tracks were both covers, a fact most people don't know. Black Magic Woman was originally a Fleetwood Mac song written by Peter Green. Oye Como Va was a Tito Puente composition from the early 1960s, but Santana transformed both songs so completely that they became his. Black Magic Woman peaked at number 4 on the Hot 100. Oye Como Va reached number 13. If you were alive in 1970, those songs were inescapable, and the sound that tied them together, Carlos's warm, sustaining guitar over that driving Latin percussion, became instantly iconic. The album also contains Samba Petit, a wordless guitar instrumental that might be the single purest expression of what Carlos Santana does, no vocals, no lyrics, just a guitar singing over a gentle groove, saying something that words would only diminish. The track was conceived during a bout of jet lag in a New York City hotel room. Carlos opened his window, heard the sounds of the city, and started playing. The melody came in one take. It remains one of the most beautiful guitar pieces in rock history, and it was born from exhaustion and a window left open. The whole album was recorded in roughly 2 weeks. The band was tight from constant touring. Carlos used a modified Gibson SG through Fender twin reverb amplifiers cranked to full volume. That combination in those hands produced a tone that was grittier and warmer than almost anything else in rock at the time. Santana 3 followed in 1971, hit number 1, and produced another top 20 hit with Everybody's Everything. 3 albums, 3 massive successes. The band was one of the biggest acts in America. Carlos Santana was 24 years old. Then Santana 3's touring cycle ended, and the classic lineup fractured. Members left. Keyboardist Greg Rowley and young guitarist Neil Schon departed to form a band that would eventually become Journey. Carlos retained the rights to the Santana name, but the group that had conquered Woodstock was gone. And then he made a decision that nearly ended his commercial career. Carlos had been growing restless inside rock's constraints. His drummer Michael Shreve had introduced him to Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and the emerging world of jazz fusion. Weather Report, Herbie Hancock, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Carlos found the music revelatory. He didn't want to keep writing Evil Ways sequels. He wanted to explore. In 1972, the band released Caravanserai. It was largely instrumental, it was jazz-infused, it was spiritually themed, it was nothing like Abraxas. CBS executive Clive Davis reportedly warned Carlos that the album would destroy the band's commercial standing. He was right. Caravanserai stalled at number 8 on the Billboard chart, a significant drop from 3 consecutive number 1 albums. It eventually went platinum, but the immediate message was clear. The mainstream audience wanted the Santana they knew. Carlos didn't care. Or rather, he cared about something else entirely. Around this time, guitarist John McLaughlin introduced Carlos to Sri Chinmoy, an Indian spiritual teacher based in New York. Chinmoy accepted Carlos and his future wife Deborah as disciples in 1973. Carlos adopted the name Devadeep, meaning the lamp, light, and eye of God. He cut his long hair. When his band saw him at their next tour, they barely recognized him. Over the next decade, Carlos split his creative life in 2. As Santana, he recorded albums that tried to balance commercial accessibility with artistic ambition. Albums like Amigos in 1976 and Zebop in 1981 brought some commercial returns. As Devadeep Carlos Santana, he made deeply experimental jazz fusion records. He collaborated with McLaughlin on Love, Devotion, Surrender, a 1973 tribute to John Coltrane. He recorded Illuminations with Alice Coltrane. He released solo albums like Oneness and The Swing of Delight that ventured into territories most rock audiences wouldn't follow. He was transparent about where his heart was. He once said that Santana was his nose, but Devadeep was his heart. The spiritual journey wasn't just about music. Chinmoy's demands on his followers' lives were significant. He imposed strict rules, he required devotion, and eventually he refused to allow Carlos and Deborah to start a family. Carlos also began to feel that his fame was being used to increase the guru's visibility. In 1982, after roughly a decade as Chinmoy's disciple, Carlos and Deborah left. The split was difficult but necessary. Carlos's connection to spirituality never disappeared, it simply evolved. By the early 1990s, he described himself as a born-again Christian and began viewing his music as a form of healing, a way to transmit something larger than entertainment. The toll of that decade wasn't only spiritual. Carlos's personal life was complicated by the pressures of fame, the demands of his guru, and the difficulty of being a public rock star who'd rejected the rock star lifestyle. Band members rotated constantly. Creative disagreements were frequent. The balance between commercial obligation and artistic integrity produced tension in every direction. But Carlos kept playing. Whatever was happening off stage, the guitar never stopped. After the split with Chinmoy, something quieter took hold. Carlos didn't abandon the idea that music had a purpose beyond entertainment. He just stopped letting someone else define what that purpose was. He meditated, he played benefit concerts, he spoke about music as healing, and he kept touring night after night, playing the guitar the way he'd always played it, for audiences who still showed up, even as the culture around him shifted. The 1980s were unkind to Carlos Santana's commercial standing. He continued to record, he continued to tour. He played Live Aid in 1985 and Amnesty International concerts in 1986. He scored the Richie Valens biopic La Bamba. He jammed with the Grateful Dead, with jazz pianist McCoy Tyner, with Weather Report. He earned his first Grammy Award in 1988 for Best Rock Instrumental Performance on his solo album Blues for Salvador. The critics noticed, the public didn't, but his studio albums were no longer charting meaningfully. Beyond Appearances in 1985 peaked at number 50. Freedom in 1987 reached only 95. The music industry was changing, synthesizers dominated, MTV favored visual spectacle, a Latin rock guitarist who emphasized sustained guitar tone over flashy production was easy to overlook. In 1990, Santana released Spirits Dancing in the Flesh. It was his third consecutive album that failed to go gold or platinum. Columbia Records, his home label since Clive Davis had signed him in the late 1960s, dropped him. 22 years of history ended with a phone call. He signed with Polydor. In 1992, they released Milagro. The album peaked at number 102 on the Billboard 200. It was the first Santana studio album that didn't reach the top 100. Sacred Fire, a live album, came out in 1993 and peaked at 181. The Santana Brothers album in 1994 barely scraped the chart at all. Carlos Santana was now in his late 40s. He couldn't get a major label deal. Industry executives viewed him as a relic. He was drifting closer and closer to the oldies circuit, playing his 1970s hits for audiences who remembered them from high school. He still sold concert tickets, but the idea that Carlos Santana would ever produce a hit record again seemed finished. He had musical ideas, but nowhere to record them. He later told Rolling Stone that he felt he had a masterpiece of joy inside him, but no one was interested in hearing it. His wife Deborah later restructured his finances, reportedly saving him from serious trouble. Without her intervention, he might have lost everything. She once said he'd probably be a hobo if it wasn't for her. Meanwhile, in 1998, the original Woodstock lineup of Santana was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was a beautiful honor. It was also the kind of honor that usually means the industry has decided your story is over. A final bow, a retrospective gesture, a gold watch. Then, in 1997, his father Jose died, the man who'd given Carlos his first violin, his first guitar, his first understanding of what music could do to an audience. Carlos described the aftermath as numbness. He could barely listen to music for a period of time. Everything felt too heavy. The comeback, when it arrived, came from the last person anyone expected to believe in Carlos Santana's commercial viability. It came from Clive Davis. Davis was the same executive who'd signed Santana to Columbia in 1968. He'd since built Arista Records into a powerhouse. And in the late 1990s, Davis attended a Santana concert and noticed something. The audience was diverse, different ages, different backgrounds, all responding to the same guitar. Davis saw potential where everyone else saw nostalgia. He signed Santana to Arista with a specific arrangement. Carlos would control half the album. Davis would control the other half, selecting songwriters and collaborators who could build radio-friendly songs around Santana's guitar. The idea was controversial. Some saw it as a sellout, but Davis framed it as a challenge. Could Carlos bring real energy to pop music without abandoning his identity? Carlos said yes. Before approaching Davis, he'd been turned away by 5 other record labels. All of them dismissed him. Davis was the only one who saw what was still there. There was also a moment that preceded the Arista deal. In 1998, Lauryn Hill invited Carlos to play guitar on her song To Zion from the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. The album became one of the biggest records of the year. At the Grammy ceremony that February, Hill closed the show by performing To Zion with Santana on guitar. It was a brief appearance, but it mattered. It put Carlos Santana back on a major stage, playing alongside one of the most important artists in contemporary music. It reminded people that his guitar still had power. Davis noticed, and then he went to work. The concept was elegant, pair Carlos Santana's immediately recognizable guitar with the voices of contemporary hitmakers. Don't ask Carlos to become someone else. Let the collaborators come to him. The album would be called Supernatural. The session stretched from 1997 to 1999. Davis assembled a roster that spanned genres: Lauryn Hill, Dave Matthews, Everlast, Eric Clapton, Wyclef Jean, CeeLo Green, Eagle-Eye Cherry, the Mexican rock band Mana. Each track was designed around a different voice, but the connecting thread was always the same: that warm, crying, unmistakable guitar. The last song added to the record was the one that changed everything. Rob Thomas, the lead singer of Matchbox 20, co-wrote a track with songwriter Etol Schur. The original demo was rough. Carlos reportedly couldn't tell if the singer was male or female. Clive Davis told him to be patient. They recorded the song in 3 takes. It sounded like a band playing in a room, live, unpolished, electric. The song was called Smooth. Rob Thomas later said he was very aware that he was writing for Carlos, not for himself. The word smooth came to him as a double meaning. It described the girl in the song, but it also described Carlos's guitar playing, that smooth, liquid, sustained heavy tone that had been Carlos's signature since the late 1960s. Thomas wrote the lyrics in one sitting. The chemistry between his raspy vocal delivery and Carlos's searing guitar was, in Thomas's words, lightning in a bottle. Supernatural was released on June 15, 1999. Smooth came out as the lead single the same day. The song climbed the Billboard Hot 100 and reached number 1 on October 30, 1999. It stayed at number 1 for 12 non-consecutive weeks. It spent 30 weeks in the top 10. It became the final number 1 song of the 1990s and the first number 1 song of the 2000s. It was eventually ranked as the second most successful song in the entire history of the Hot 100. Carlos Santana was 52 years old. He hadn't had a top 10 hit in nearly 3 decades, and now he had the biggest song in America, but Smooth was just the beginning. Maria Maria, featuring Wyclef Jean, also went to number 1. The album sold 15 million copies in the United States alone. Worldwide, the number approached 30 million. Supernatural spent 12 non-consecutive weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. Then came the Grammys. On February 23, 2000, Carlos Santana walked to the podium 8 times, 8 Grammy Awards in a single night, tying the record Michael Jackson had set with Thriller in 1983, Album of the Year, Record of the Year, Song of the Year for Thomas and Schur's composition, Best Rock Album, Best Pop Performance, Best Rock Performance, Best Pop Collaboration, Best Rock Instrumental. The total came to 9 Grammys when you included Song of the Year, which went to the songwriters. Sheryl Crow, accepting her own award that night, thanked Carlos Santana for not being nominated in her category. The audience laughed, but the laughter carried something heavier beneath it: recognition, 30 years of work compressed into a single impossible evening. Before Supernatural, Santana had seemed more like a candidate for one of those valedictory Lifetime Achievement Awards than a serious contender for Album of the Year. Nobody expected a 52-year-old guitarist to outsell the entire teen pop era that dominated 1999. Nobody expected the man from Woodstock to compete with Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys. And yet, Carlos later said the night felt daunting. He described himself as a dog retrieving a frisbee, going back and forth to the stage again and again. He'd been nominated for Grammys before Supernatural, but had won only once, in 1988, 30 years of work. And then, in one night, everything. The strangest part of the Supernatural story isn't the sales or the awards. It's how Santana managed to become relevant to an audience that hadn't been born when he played Woodstock. A teenager in 1999, hearing Smooth on the radio, had no context for Abraxas, no memory of Soul Sacrifice. To them, Carlos Santana was simply a guitarist on a song they liked. They didn't know they were listening to a man who'd been building that sound for 40 years. That's the real achievement. Santana didn't reinvent himself for the comeback. He didn't change his guitar tone. He didn't adopt new techniques. He didn't pretend to be younger or more modern than he was. He played exactly the way he'd always played: sustained notes, singing vibrato, melodic lines that treated the guitar like a human voice. What changed was the frame around him: Rob Thomas's vocals, Clive Davis's A&R strategy, the radio-friendly songwriting. The frame was new, the guitar was the same guitar that had played Soul Sacrifice 30 years earlier. And that's why the Carlos Santana story is unlike almost any other in popular music. Most artists get one window, one era, one cultural moment. The rare ones get a second act that's a fraction of the first. Santana didn't just get a second act, his second act was bigger than the first. Supernatural outsold every album he'd ever made. It won more awards in one night than he'd accumulated in 30 years. It introduced his playing to an entirely new generation. His career after Supernatural continued. Shaman in 2002 was another collaboration-driven album that hit #1 and produced another #1 single, The Game of Love, featuring Michelle Branch. He continued touring, eventually headlining a multi-year residency at the House of Blues in Las Vegas. He married drummer Cindy Blackman in 2010, and she joined his touring band. Rolling Stone ranked him the 20th greatest guitarist of all time in 2015, then moved him up to 11th in 2023. He founded the Milagro Foundation with Deborah to support underserved children and youth through education, health, and the arts. The foundation has donated millions of dollars. But Carlos Santana's influence extends beyond his own records. Before Santana, congas and timbales were not standard instruments in rock bands. After Santana, Latin percussion became an accepted, even expected element in mainstream rock and pop production. He didn't invent Latin rock, but he brought it to Woodstock, to the Billboard charts, and to the Grammy stage. He proved that a Mexican guitarist playing blues-infused melodies over Afro-Cuban rhythms could reach the largest audiences in the world, twice. But the numbers and the accolades aren't what make Carlos Santana's story unusual. What makes it unusual is the contradiction at the center of his life. He's a rock star who explored jazz fusion when rock fans wanted rock. He's a Latin musician who refused to be boxed into Latin music. He's a blues guitarist who followed an Indian guru. He's a pop hitmaker who spent a decade unable to get a record deal. He fits every category and none of them. Most musicians find a sound and protect it. Santana found a sound and kept leaving it, only to discover that the thing he was searching for was always inside the guitar tone he'd had since Tijuana. The sustained cry, the singing vibrato, the melody that cuts through whatever arrangement surrounds it. That sound survived mariachi, blues, psychedelic rock, jazz fusion, spiritual devotion, commercial decline, and one of the greatest comeback albums ever recorded. Carlos Santana once said that he's not a survivor. Survivor implies you barely made it. He called himself triumphant. That distinction matters. It tells you how he sees his own story, not as a series of obstacles endured, but as a series of choices made. Every turn, from the violin to the guitar, from Mexico to San Francisco, from rock to jazz fusion, from commercial decline to supernatural, was a choice. Some of those choices cost him dearly, and he'd make them all again. There's a boy in Otlanda, Navarro, watching his father play violin in a dirt-floored bar. He doesn't like the violin. He wants the guitar. He doesn't know that 50 years later he'll be standing on a Grammy stage holding his 8th trophy of the night. He doesn't know that the sound he's about to discover somewhere between Mexico and America, between blues and Latin percussion, between technique and pure feeling, will become one of the most recognizable sounds in the history of recorded music. Carlos Santana didn't become a legend because he found the perfect sound. He became a legend because every time the world thought it had figured him out, he found a completely different way to make it listen.